slide setup, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Kasia Paprocki is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She holds a PhD in development sociology from this very department here at Cornell, so welcome back. Her work draws on and contributes to the study of political economy of development and agrarian change with a focus in South Asia. She is the author of the newly released, or almost very newly released book, titled Threatening Dystopias, The Global Politics of Climate Change Adaptation in Bangladesh. So without further ado, over to you, Kasia, and welcome back to the department.
Thank you so much for having me. You're looking at my screen and not my notes, right? Okay, great.
Looks good.
Such an incredible pleasure to be here, and I actually am glad that I can't see everyone's faces because I saw a lot of people coming in who I would just love to chat with, and what a weird thing to see people who I haven't seen so long, just sort of names online. So anyway, I'm so thrilled to be sharing this work with you and to be sort of virtually visiting Cornell. Before I get going, though, I feel the need to preface this talk with a couple quick acknowledgements. The first, of course, is that I'm zooming into this talk hosted on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, so I want to acknowledge the violent history of dispossession on the land now occupied by Cornell. And secondly, particularly because many of you may have heard about this, I need to acknowledge that the UK's University and College Union, of which I am a member, and which is the trade union representing academics and researchers in the UK, has been on strike for the last 3 days, which is to say that I have been on strike until just about an hour ago. The strike is focused on threats to our pensions, as well as job insecurity and higher education in general. And after discussing with several colleagues, I've determined that because it's 8 p.m. in London right now, I'm not crossing a picket line to be with you virtually today. But I do feel the need to recognize that we've been on strike, and specifically that the epidemic of precarious employment and casualization of academic labor is just as bad, if not worse, in the United States as it is in the UK. As evidenced by a recent wave of strikes among precarious academic laborers from the UCs to Columbia. Over 75% of university faculty are now off the tenure track, and of these, over 50% are working part-time as adjuncts. It's not good for us, it's not good for our students, and those of us who have the privilege of secure employment have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with our precarious colleagues. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me with that. And also just thank you so much for having me with you today. It's a huge honor to be coming back to Cornell to share with you about this new book. I really appreciate David and Marvi and Jenny's work to organize this inaugural Critical Development Studies seminar series. The book is based on the dissertation that I wrote as a PhD student in what was then development sociology. So this is actually not the first time I'm sharing some of this work at Cornell. Although I understand there have been a lot of changes since I was last there. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the possibility of rural futures in the time of climate change, about who has the power to determine those futures, and about how that power is exercised. I'm going to talk to you about the implications of dystopic visions of a climate changed future for policy and for the livelihoods of people that are seen as under threat, particularly in places like rural Bangladesh. I'm also going to talk to you about a very different vision of the future being pursued by some rural communities in Bangladesh and how they're resisting those dystopic imaginaries. I argue that these alternative imaginaries are critical to understanding and shaping policies for climate change adaptation. So I'll start by showing you a very brief animation that frames the context of what I'm going to talk to you about today. It appeared on the front page of the New York Times website a couple months after I started fieldwork for this project in early 2014. I'll talk afterwards about what I think is notable about the clip, but for now, make sure to note the area on the map labeled as Dhaka, which is roughly the area where my field sites are located. All right, so this is the sort of common sense in the Gramscian sense of climate change in Bangladesh. It's perhaps even already familiar to you. The video demonstrates a global narrative circulating about Bangladesh's impending climate dystopia. A few key takeaway points the viewer is likely to have gleaned from this video and other narratives like it are that the social and ecological changes addressed are the result of climate change. The second would be that the region is existentially vulnerable, meaning it's being like imminently wiped off the map. And the third is that the changes are inevitable. This is very well-worn territory for global narratives about Bangladesh. A couple other recent examples. The Guardian posted a story about how rice farming in coastal Bangladesh has become impossible. And Nick Kristof, also of the New York Times, wrote a story about how climate change is forcing Bangladeshi farmers to arrange child marriages for their underage daughters. So this is really bleak stuff, right? In contrast to this particular imaginary of the region, I make three key arguments. The first is that there are many other explanations for vulnerability in the Delta region, some of which are directly related to the very development and climate change interventions intended to address that vulnerability. The second is that an infrastructure has emerged to respond to these threats, which has in many ways exacerbated them. And the third is that the sense of crisis emerging out of these narratives creates opportunities for dispossession and accumulation. And so I'll examine each of these claims, although not quite in this order. So my talk, as I said, comes out of the material in my new book being published this month, just like less than 2 weeks from now, by Cornell University Press. It's a political ecology of climate change in coastal Bangladesh. It examines the history, discourses, understandings of, and responses to ecological change in that region today. A brief overview of what I'll talk about in this seminar. I'll start with an introduction, talk through my research methods, what I did and how, along with the discussion of the context the project grows out of. Then I'll tell you about the theoretical framework through which I understand what's happening now in Bangladesh and what I call the adaptation regime. I'll spend a bit of time discussing the politics of knowledge production about ecological change in Bangladesh today. And finally, I'll walk through 3 different rural communities that illuminate these dynamics in different ways. And I'll talk about how some of these communities are addressing the environmental changes that they're facing. I focus on the region of Khulna in southwestern Bangladesh. It's a primarily rural coastal district, which, as you can see in the map on the right, is made up of a network of small islands at the base of the delta of the Ganga, Meghna, and Brahmaputra rivers bordering the Bay of Bengal. Khulna is an important region for understanding these dynamics, both because it's experiencing a great variety of ecological changes, and also because it's home to the greatest density of climate change adaptation programs in Bangladesh. Khulna is considered the most vulnerable region to climate change in Bangladesh, and it's also often referred to as one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change in the world. Okay, so here's an overview of my research methods. This involved 2 years of multi-sited ethnographic research, building on work I've been doing in Bangladesh for about 15 years, and in Khulna in particular since 2012. I use this multi-sited approach across multiple nodes and geographic scales in order to connect how they fit together, and also to understand how power operates between them. In Dhaka, I conducted interviews and participant observation with donors, development practitioners, government officials, and scientists. I worked in 3 rural communities, as I said, in Khulna, where the impacts of these environmental changes are being experienced in different ways. I also conducted research internationally at climate change conferences in Paris, Rotterdam, Kolkata, Bonn, and Kuala Lumpur. And I conducted research in several archives to understand the history of human intervention in this region, which has shaped the current landscape and the vulnerability of communities inhabiting it. One really important factor shaping these different understandings of ecological change is an analysis of historical dynamics and their role in shaping the region today. So to that end, and I don't have time to go into a full history of the region, although it's a fascinating history, so I'd be very happy to answer questions about it. But a few things which are really important to note. The region has been seen as both vulnerable and precarious since the colonial period, and thus subjected to many periods of social and physical engineering. During the Green Revolution in the 1960s, a system of embankments was built across the coastal zone with US and Dutch finance and engineering expertise. The embankments and the islands that they contain came to be known as polders, after the Dutch word for low-lying islands surrounded by protective dikes. In the 1980s, when development agencies started promoting a transition from rice farming to shrimp cultivation under structural adjustment programs, the polders started being used to keep water in instead of to keep it out, and I'll return to this later. The polders have been implicated in many of the ecological changes, ecological problems the region is experiencing today, most of which are commonly attributed to climate change. So that brings me to my primary intervention, which is that in response to these ongoing and anticipated threats, a new regime has emerged that involves both continuities and ruptures with previous development regimes in Bangladesh. The adaptation regime is a socially and historically specific configuration of power involving both epistemic and material elements that shapes the way the landscape is understood and managed. It encompasses the scope of particular development activities considered suitable for climate change adaptation. It disciplines understandings of the futures and livelihood strategies which are seen as viable now and in the future. And it facilitates accumulation. And it does this in particular through a vision of a transition away from agrarian livelihoods toward urban export-oriented production and the radical transformation and dispossession of rural communities. The foundations of this regime are grounded in the historical relations of development in Bangladesh, and in two dynamics in particular. That is, first, the idea of Bangladesh as a basket case, in the infamous words of Henry Kissinger. And the second is the related use of rural Bangladesh as a development laboratory, where researchers and development agencies are free and welcome to experiment with new technologies in development and adaptation. So these historical dynamics of development, both epistemic and material, also play a critical role in the adaptation regime. The adaptation regime importantly involves the spatial governance of water and land management, along with various other development activities and production practices. It is not a unified or coherent vision, although it does contain several key continuities. So this is a map that was shared with me by a World Bank consultant who said that it's replicated in various forms in almost every internal report or proposal circulated within and among development agencies conducting adaptation work in the coastal zone. The map indicates which agencies are operating which programs in various polders with the intention of avoiding duplication and claiming particular spaces for particular modes of intervention. Now, this version of the map, which reflects only a handful of the most relevant projects for this specific report, indicates a series of programs supported by the World Bank and the Dutch Embassy, each of which refers to a different paradigm of landscape, engineering, water, and land management, and potential accumulation. The polders indicated in green on the map are listed as available for Blue Gold, which is a recent Dutch program supporting similar work. The map reflects how the landscape and the authority to shape its future are divided up and managed under the adaptation regime, far from communities that inhabit it. Now, one of the most significant continuities with prior development regimes is that the transition from a rural economy to an urban one is seen as a necessary and positive development. Under the adaptation regime, these discourses about urbanization have merged with those concerning climate migration, a narrative that renders migration both inevitable and desirable. This new narrative about the inevitability and desirability of migration in the time of climate change and its relationship with development is not particular to Bangladesh, of course. At a side event at COP21, the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris in December 2015, I heard a talk by a development practitioner who had this to say, and I'll read it. We need to talk about development and climate change together. Development needs to be at the center of the conversation about climate change. If we go ahead 30 years down the road, if we're looking at a village today, maybe no one in that village will live there anymore, and they'll all be working in a garment factory down the road. So our job as development practitioners is to help manage that structural transformation for the benefit of the people who live in those villages. So even as this unidentified village in the practitioner's parable is intended to refer to essentially any village anywhere in the world, it also very concretely pertains to the vision of development generated under the adaptation regime in Bangladesh in particular. The idea that people might move out of their villages into Dhaka, or Bangladesh's capital, or peri-urban export processing zones where they can get jobs in garment manufacturing is a central part of this vision for adaptation in Bangladesh today. It is this vision of the importance of such migration to Bangladesh that a program manager from DFID, which is the UK's former development agency, was referring to when I heard him give a talk in Dhaka about the climate migration dividend at a seminar on climate migration. At the same seminar, attendees were given a bag of sort of development swag, which if you've spent any time working in development in Bangladesh, you've seen is very common. It included this mug, which says, "Livelihood migration, not a threat, a tool for climate change adaptation." Now, what I want to point out about this narrative, and this is something that I heard repeatedly in my research, is that it's predicated on the idea that rural lives in Khulna may not be worth saving. In this way, migration becomes a solution not only to climate change, but also to the normative problem of rural livelihoods, which are not part of this vision for a developed Bangladesh. So in addition to examining the political economy of development and adaptation, in the book I also investigate how these existing political economies shape what is known and thought to be known about the landscape and how it is changing in the context of climate change. I'm specifically interested in how attempts to understand this landscape are entangled with efforts to change it. The very science that seeks to understand these patterns both shapes and is shaped by them. One concrete example is contestations surrounding land loss. You've likely heard this narrative of Bangladesh's massive predicted land loss, depicted in maps of the country going underwater, like the one that I showed earlier. But how much land mass will Bangladesh lose, and why? So while claims of rapid sea level rise often lead to predictions of massive land loss in coastal Bangladesh, in the process of translation to policy and popular narratives, these claims often conflate climate drivers with other drivers of environmental change. This is really important because land loss due to climate change leads to policy projections of the need for massive relocations of coastal communities, essentially based on the idea that catastrophic land loss is inevitable. Other drivers of land loss might have different implications for policy. So first, absolute sea level rise and relative sea level rise are often conflated. Absolute sea level rise refers to the increased volume of the oceans. This is due to climate change. And relative sea level rise refers to the height of the sea relative to land at a particular point. This is often driven by the vertical movement of the land itself. In the case of Bangladesh's coastline, the land itself is rapidly subsiding, causing relative sea level rise. This is a natural dynamic in the delta, but it's become an acute problem largely because of the system of polder embankments I mentioned earlier. These embankments prevent the natural buildup of the land that balances out this subsidence. Erosion is also often conflated with sea level rise. This is depicted in the pictures like this one from Reuters that you might have seen in stories about climate change in Bangladesh. What's missing here is that this active delta is in a constant state of both erosion and accretion, which means that sediments are constantly moving between land and water throughout the river system. This often manifests in erosion, like you see here, but it also manifests as accretion, meaning the land is built up by the sediments moving from one place to another. Now, as you can see in this map, which was created by the late physical geographer Hugh Brammer, this map depicts erosion in blue and accretion in red. The coastline is actually accreting faster than it is eroding. Some natural scientists believe that the increased sediment load coming down from the Himalayas, from glaciers melting due to climate change, will cause Bangladesh's landmass to grow instead of to shrink, even in the context of losses due to absolute sea level rise in the future. So these competing narratives of land loss are important because of their implications to the management of the landscape. While the political economy of development in the region shapes these understandings of environmental change, at the same time, the sense of inevitability of land loss also shapes how production and social reproduction in the region are governed. So here I'm going to shift to talking about the 3 sites in Khulna where I conducted research with farmers and rural communities. I chose these sites because they've taken very different approaches to navigating the ongoing transformations in the region, and because they illuminate the different possibilities for ongoing rural livelihoods there. The first community is in Polder 23, which has almost entirely transitioned from rice agriculture to shrimp aquaculture starting in the 1980s. In order to better understand the nature of outmigration from Khulna, I also conducted interviews in a slum in Kolkata with migrants who left Polder 23, but I see this as essentially an extension of my work in that field site. Second, Polder 22 has historically resisted this transition to shrimp, largely through the mobilization of a landless social movement, and therefore farmers there continue to grow rice and other agricultural crops. And finally, farmers in Polder 29 have transitioned from shrimp back to the earlier mode of agricultural production through the same social mobilization we see in Polder 22. So I mentioned earlier the transition from rice farming to shrimp cultivation, and this is where that transition comes back into play. These are images from Polder 23, the island in Khulna where shrimp has been produced commercially since the early 80s. As you can see, most of the trees in this village have died, and little else grows there but shrimp. Shrimp has been celebrated as a key strategy in climate change adaptation in Khulna, as a means of creating an opportunity out of a threat. This is a logic you may recognize from Naomi Klein's discussion of disaster capitalism. The idea is that if the landscape will become increasingly waterlogged and salinated, making it unsuitable for agriculture, then it will be more suitable for commercial shrimp production, which, by the way, is Bangladesh's 2nd largest export after garments. Never mind that waterlogging and increased soil salinity are themselves often caused by shrimp cultivation. But, and here's where migration comes back in, shrimp cultivation requires somewhere between 1 and 10% of the amount of labor as rice farming, which means that the significant populations of farmers, in particular the majority sharecroppers and landless laborers, are forced to migrate out of Khulna to find work. In this way, the transition from rice to shrimp plays a really critical role in the adaptation regime, both in the sense that it contributes to many of the social and ecological changes it claims to avert, and also that as a solution to climate change, it facilitates a particular vision of a developed future in both rural and urban communities. This logic then of expanding shrimp aquaculture as a climate change adaptation strategy shares important parallels with longer histories of development through transformed landscapes and production relations in the region. This slogan painted outside the fisheries department in Khulna speaks to this directly. It says, Mach Chingri Poribesh Dridro Mukto Bangladesh, which I roughly translate to, Bangladesh will be free of poverty when the landscape is covered in fish and shrimp. It is the same logic that was indicated in the 2013 World Bank report, which noted that improving rural productivity by modernizing agriculture and diversifying non-farm activities in order to free up manpower for use in more productive activities is also essential for growth. Many of these migrants whose manpower has been freed up end up in Kolkata, where they live in slums on the outskirts of the city, searching for work in construction, building luxury apartment high-rises and office buildings. Now, despite this bleak vision of the future in Polder 23, just across the river in Polder 22, a social movement of landless workers has mobilized to pursue a different vision of rural futures. That is, since the introduction of commercial shrimp production in the 80s, movement members in Polder 22 have resisted the transition to shrimp and have continued to successfully farm rice, as was traditional in the region. They do this through a combination of activist and economic strategies, including pressing for their rights to access common lands, building their economic capacity through cooperative farming enterprises, and developing seed banks for the preservation of indigenous seed varieties, which support ongoing subsistence production. Their success in this social mobilization has largely been galvanized by the memorialization of Karunamoy Sardar, a movement leader who was murdered in 1990 by outsiders who intended to grab land in Polder 22 for shrimp cultivation. Karunamoy's martyrdom continues to be commemorated today in an event that draws thousands from all over the region. At Karunamoy Day in 2014, one local movement member urged those gathered from neighboring communities to join them in their struggle against shrimp, saying, "You can see how beautiful our environment is here in Polder 22. We have goats, cows, chickens, and fresh water. It's because of our leaders that the environment is still so beautiful here." Now, this man's appeals highlight the great importance of social mobilization and human-environment interaction, to which these community members attribute the dynamics shaping Khulna's changing ecology. Today, this movement is gaining traction in surrounding communities which had already made the transition to shrimp, motivated largely by the social and ecological impacts we observed earlier in Polder 23. I took this picture in 2012 in Polder 29, where landless movement members have successfully organized to return to rice cultivation. Now, this picture is from roughly the same spot in 2014. This return is noteworthy not only because of the inequality characterizing the local political economy of land, but also because areas like this are widely thought of as unviable for continued rice cultivation in the time of climate change. After about 7 years of flushing salinity through the monsoon rains and of not cultivating shrimp, the land has returned to its former fertility, and farmers are now successfully cultivating rice and vegetables. Perhaps more importantly, all of the community members, landless laborers, and sharecroppers who had been forced to migrate out of the village earlier for work have now returned to participate again in agricultural production. The story of Polder 29, I suggest, is important not only to the politics of rice versus shrimp. It highlights two very important dimensions of understanding climate change. The first is that it's essential to understand the impacts of climate change firmly alongside other dynamics shaping local ecologies. And second, we need to be very careful about making claims about the kinds of futures that are viable and which are not, as these are embedded in normative understandings of developed presents and futures. Rather, climate justice must entail the self-determination of local communities in imagining both what is possible and what is desirable. So very briefly in conclusion, I've demonstrated that adaptation both responds to and produces social and ecological transformation, and that the adaptation regime is a useful lens through which to understand the material and epistemic dimensions of producing and governing these transformations. More broadly, my work demonstrates that Bangladesh is not more vulnerable to climate change because of some natural proclivity of this new global environmental shift. It is more vulnerable because of a planned historical process of development within the global capitalist system. My argument, therefore, is not that the ecological crisis in southern Bangladesh is not related to climate change. It is that the ecological crisis cannot be understood outside of the social, political, and economic drivers which have produced it historically. This intervention then is important not just in Bangladesh, but in all communities that are navigating uncertain and unequal socio-ecological futures in the time of climate change. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this really fascinating presentation. It's been really great hearing about your work. I know that I am really, really looking forward to reading your entire book. So I think now we can open the floor to questions. So anyone in the audience, feel free to either use the raise your hand button on Zoom or put your question in the chat. And maybe while we're waiting for folks to organize their thoughts, one question that I had is that you really hit home, right, on that one of the key functions of the adaptation regime that you conceptualize is that it creates opportunities for dispossession. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about who is taking advantage of those processes of dispossession. My sense is that a lot of it has to do with the shrimp cultivation. So who is investing in that type of shift? Are they people from the communities who are already living there? Are they outside investors? Are they large corporations? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's such an interesting question and a really important one. I think that one of the sort of challenges in thinking about what's new with adaptation and how are these processes that I'm trying to understand different from previous development regimes is that those dynamics of dispossession have always been there. And so I'd say that all of the new opportunities for dispossession just sort of build on the existing power dynamics and social relations that already were there and sort of already characterized development regimes in Bangladesh. So I think that the adaptation regime intensifies them, and it creates sort of new opportunities for more kind of profound forms of dispossession. But the actors who are involved in those social relations are, yes, certainly, like you said, wealthy farmers or sort of urban elites who invest in shrimp farming, and they've been doing that, like I said, since the 80s. Also, obviously, a lot of development agencies that are investing in these projects have their own interests in sort of how to reconfigure social relations in similar ways that they already were, but in a more intensified process. And I think that I guess the point is not to say that there are new relations of dispossession, but that we need to understand those existing forms of dispossession and then how they intersect with the relations of climate change adaptation to sort of create these dynamics of dispossession in the context of climate change.
Thanks so much. Yeah. David K.
Hi, David.
Thank you. Hi, how are you? Thank you.
Good, nice to see you.
Really interesting talk. I have many questions. I'll just ask one. Well, I'll ask two versions of it. This is kind of about the construction of the imaginaries or narratives about what's going on, and it seems one of the constructions I'm familiar with. I don't know much about Bangladesh at all, but just in general about climate change, is both in popular and academic press, is that it's actually mostly operates as an accelerant or multiplier of forces that are already in play, both social and ecological forces. And in some ways, part of what you're talking about is an example of that, particularly in your answer to your previous question. So I'm kind of wondering if you could go in a little more into the, sort of like who has a stake in which narratives and why, which is also related, but at the broader level. And then another version of that is you started out with the idea, you were quoting some stories in Western press. I mean, at least I can't remember all of them, but they were directed at global North audiences as far as I could tell. So I'm kind of wondering whether you think when you cite a narrative like that, is it even about what's going on in Bangladesh, as opposed to, and why you draw on those narratives, as opposed to like an alternative hypothesis would be it's intended to reinforce pre-existing narratives of climate change that have nothing to do with Bangladesh specifically.
Yeah, thanks for these excellent questions. They're really important questions. And also, I see that Shelley Feldman is in the audience, and she asked me very similar questions when I was first considering this project. So I think they've always sort of been at the center of what my own questions are. The reason that it's really important to I'm sort of starting from this second question, which I think is the answer to the second question is also the answer to the first question about these media narratives are not targeted at Bangladesh, and why, why does it matter? Why do those media narratives in like the New York Times matter to how we understand what's happening in Bangladesh? And the reason that they matter is because they shape our understandings of what's happening there and our ideas about how to intervene. And so both the sort of development actors who are planning that region now, and then also the scientists who are trying to understand what's happening there, even their science is shaped by those sort of existing ideas about this catastrophic future. And so in the book, I have a couple chapters that are sort of science and technology studies informed examinations of how is it that these ideas about catastrophic, inevitable crisis in Bangladesh shape what's known about the region, and then also shape sort of how we act in the face of it. So climate migration is a really good example, because there are all of these sort of consortia of like scientists that are interdisciplinary scientists. They include some, sociologists like us, and then a lot of natural scientists and computer modelers and things like that. So there are all of these consortia of scientists from the UK, Europe, and the United States who are trying to understand what's going on in coastal Bangladesh in the context of climate change, and their work feeds into all of these development projects that I'm talking about and sort of shapes how those plans are made. And these scientists, all of us know how it works when you're writing a grant proposal. If you think that climate migration is happening and you want to understand it, and Bangladesh is the place that you've heard it's going to be the worst, you go looking for climate migration in Bangladesh. And the process of looking for it helps you to find it. So I had a lot of conversations with scientists about how you could see what's happening there as a climate migration. You could potentially see it as something else, but if you see it as climate migration, it helps you to understand, sort of to confirm the priors that you came with. So for example, I talked to one person who was leading this study that's been cited by, I saw this study cited by every major development agency working in the coastal region. And when I asked him how they came to these conclusions about these like millions and millions of people who are projected to migrate out of the region, he said, well, first we did the study, and after conducting our analysis, we found that basically there was no climate migration. But then we looked back at our data again and we said, well, if we took every migratory event, of which there are many because it's a region where there's a lot of sort of seasonal agricultural migration, if we looked at every agricultural or every migratory event in the time of climate change, which is like the last, 10 or 20 years, and we said those migrations took place in the time of climate change and that makes them climate migrations, then we could project that there would be millions and millions of climate migrants. This is true, right? If it is the case that if you analyze the data in that way, you're going to see something different. If you go looking for it, you may find it, right? And so the way that these ideas sort of in the New York Times shape the ideas of scientists about Bangladesh as this sort of doomed space that is, going underwater and that millions of people are going to flood out of, that then feeds into development projects that say, okay, what do we do with these millions of people who are going to have to flee the coastal zone? And that's not to say that there won't be sea level rise and climate migration, but it is to say that those sort of convictions about this doomed future of crisis in the region are unequally distributed with coastal communities. So for example, New York City also has faced recent extreme weather events, and that has caused extreme flooding. And those weather events are projected to continue and become worse in the future. But nobody's saying we need to go understand climate migration and millions of climate refugees who are going to flood across the borders into New Jersey because these are going to, create these major security concerns, and we need to get these people out of there. So I think that, okay, so I guess then just to sort of wrap up answering your second question, I think that we all have a stake in these narratives about what's going to happen in coastal Bangladesh, because it's a kind of canary in a coal mine. And there's this great piece by this academic in Australia, Carol Farbatko, about what she calls wishful sinking. She says that, the Pacific, she writes about the Pacific Islands and Tuvalu, and how in the Pacific Islands, they're going underwater, but they only become important to this sort of global imaginary of what happens when the seas rise once they are underwater. And I think Bangladesh is also vulnerable to this same kind of logic. I see that Ronnie Kaufman has his hand up, and I'm excited and nervous about what he has to say because I know he's been working in Bangladesh a lot longer than me.
Well, I just wondered what you thought about the importance of cyclonic storms. I've been going in and out a long time since 1972, and my perception is a lot of people do return and start cultivating rice, as you mentioned, but then sea level is for sure rising, and the intensity of these storms is they are intensifying, or at least that's my belief and understanding. So tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people die during some of these storms, and there's a huge surge of migration to Dhaka and elsewhere. So it seems like that phenomenon is getting worse. Is that your perception?
Yeah, so it's my understanding from interviews that I've conducted with natural scientists who are working to understand, who know a lot more than I do about sort of projections of these storms in the future, that it is not necessarily the case that it's clear that the severity and frequency of the storms is picking up due to climate change, but that for sure it is projected that it will do so in the future. But what we've seen right now is that there have been these cyclonic storms, and they have had really often catastrophic effects. And so trying to understand those effects helps us to understand what will happen in the future under climate change. So that's sort of part of your question. The other part of your question is just about, what I've seen about the effects of these storms. And I have seen negative impacts of cyclones in recent years. What I have seen has been the biggest problem is weakened embankments that are breached, and then the islands flood during the storms. And so the reason that most of these embankments are not holding up to these storms is because they've been weakened by shrimp farming. So first of all, the embankments are sort of deteriorate with the salt from the shrimp from the ponds, and then also shrimp farmers drill these bore big holes for PVC pipes to bring salt water in, and that weakens the infrastructure and also makes them vulnerable to breakage. And so, in the last several years, and I've visited many communities that have been really devastated by storms like this, that is becoming increasingly a problem, right? And it's especially a problem because, as I said, these embankments were built starting in the 1960s on this Dutch hydraulic model, which is unfit for Bangladesh's active tidal delta. The land has sunk and is increasingly going below the level. So when you get a major storm surge during a cyclone and the land sinks and then the embankment breaks, then the entire island floods. So it's not totally clear, and all of the environmentalists and activists who I've talked to about, so what do you think the answer is to this problem? It's not really clear how to deal with these, the embankments that have been built on these flawed designs that have now made the land already start sinking. But so just one example that I think is a really kind of devastating example of what this looks like, and how this plays out is in Polder 22. I mentioned this project, this Blue Gold project that was sort of imagining in 2014 what they were going to do and where. And they actually decided we are going to implement this project in Polder 22 on to sort of create market linkages and new cash crops for Polder 22. And they brought in these projects, and they had identified a group of beneficiaries, which they said would be a cross-class coalition of farmers. And that meant that these landless collectives who had been farming the land sort of around the embankment, they lost access to the land. And this sort of cross-class coalition, which was dominated by absentee landlords, they did not maintain the embankments. And so Polder 22 had been, as I said, farmed collectively, and in particular, this sort of ring around the embankment had been farmed by these landless collectives. And as part of sort of their agreement with the state that they would be allowed to do that farming, they also maintained the embankment themselves. And in all the previous cyclones up to this cyclone in 2020, they were fine, and they said the cyclone came and our rice laid down for a couple of days and then it stood back up, and people from the surrounding area all came and sought shelter in Polder 22, and they got their drinking water there afterwards. And they were very resilient to this, to these cyclones. And you know, once these people stopped having access to the embankments to maintain them, they started deteriorating. No one maintained them, and in 2020, the embankments breached, and the entire island flooded, and they lost their entire crop. And you know, coincidentally, Blue Gold was like, "Oh well, our project is up now, so you can have the land back." And so since then, the landless collectives have been trying to sort of regain control of this land and to get somebody to help them to repair the embankment so that they can maintain them. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying, I think that there are threats, and I think that they will increase in the future. I think that people in those communities have a lot of ideas about how to address those threats, and that the adaptation interventions that are being pursued are not necessarily helping them to sort of fortify their own ideas about what might make them more resilient.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that question.
Marvi?
So thanks so much for this talk, Kasia. I really enjoyed it, particularly your framing around this idea of adaptation regimes, which I found super interesting. And actually, in that context, I wondered if you could talk a little more about the role of the state as part of this adaptation regime, and how the state really positions itself vis-a-vis different approaches to climate change, not only as kind of like the strong emerging voice from the global south in international forums, because Bangladesh has this really high visibility in terms of climate change, but also how it kind of projects or deals with its relationship within the nation, with its kind of this frontier region of coastal Bangladesh. So how it kind of pivots between these different roles and where it kind of stands in this regime. Thanks.
So wait, the second part of your question is about how the state relates to communities in the coast.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is a really good question. I see that Phil is here, and he asked me this question in my B exam, and I'm not sure that I gave him a satisfactory answer. So I guess he'll be waiting to hear how I've continued to think about the role of the state. So several important things that you've sort of touched on in what you just said. The first is, and I guess just sort of broadly what's interesting in thinking about the role of the Bangladeshi state in relation to the adaptation regime is that there are multiple scales of environmental politics surrounding how to address climate change in Bangladesh, and they look really different at the international scale than they do sort of at the local scale. And so, you know, Bangladeshi climate negotiators were basically responsible for organizing the least developed countries negotiating bloc in the sort of global climate negotiations. And you know, in the COPs, at that sort of international scale of climate politics, that has been, you know, Bangladeshi climate negotiators, people sort of working on behalf of the Bangladeshi state, have pursued the most radical kind of climate politics. What that means at the and sort of, you know, most recently what we heard at the COPs was about this idea of reparations. And so the Bangladeshi state has, you know, really been vocal in saying we are owed reparations for historic emissions because we're going to suffer the most and we've emitted the least. And I think that there's something really important about them sort of articulating that so strongly and clearly. at the local scale, the environmentalists I know have a really different take on sort of the environmental designs of the Bangladeshi state. And that means that they're really critical of, for example, coal-fired power plants that are being built in the coastal region, a strip coal mining also sort of in the north that's been really violent and caused land dispossession in communities affected by mining. I think that I think that what is what's complicated about trying to understand the Bangladeshi state as like an independent actor is that, like Abram said, the Bangladeshi, like any state is just sort of a manifestation of power relations, right? And so that is especially true of the Bangladeshi state, because the Bangladeshi state is sort of deeply shaped by its relations with international donors. And so the ways that I've tried to articulate what the adaptation regime is, I don't talk much about the Bangladeshi state because the Bangladeshi state does not act independently of its relations. It doesn't act independently vis-a-vis the adaptation regime than it does in general in relation to its relationships with international donors. And so in the coastal region, that means that the Bangladeshi state is very happy to receive the support of international donors for various kinds of adaptation interventions. One of the things that I think has sort of caused some of the biggest problems is that international donors are mostly interested in giving money for big kind of like charismatic infrastructural projects or these kind of market-based development interventions that I have focused on today. And when it comes to infrastructure, the problem with that is that these are infrastructures that require a lot of maintenance. So like the polder system which is based on this Dutch model in the Netherlands, the Dutch put millions and millions and millions of euros every year into maintaining these infrastructures, pumping water out when it comes in and all of this. The development agencies that built these in Bangladesh said, well, they'll need to be maintained, but obviously we're not going to pay for their maintenance because that's not the function of a development project. The Bangladeshi state does not see itself as responsible for maintaining these infrastructures that are built by these international donors. And so, that creates a lot of problems. And I think that in general, a big part of the problem of seeing a scenario in which international donors are instrumental in planning the future of a region that they are not sort of politically accountable to is that they aren't necessarily accountable for also imagining how that will continue and how those interventions will manifest and be maintained years down the line. Thanks for that question, which is really complicated and I think important.
No, thank you so much for answering that. I actually look at international development projects and the role of donors in Pakistan, and I struggle with this question of the role of the state a lot myself vis-a-vis these kind of like international relations and donor projects. So it's really helpful for me to hear your perspective and experience with that.
Well, I look forward to reading about your work in Pakistan.
Jenny?
Why don't I defer to Aman? I think he had a question as well.
Jenny, I feel like you were first, so you don't have to defer.
It was a duel, and you won.
Yes. Okay. Well, Kasia, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk. I really, your piece about the urban to rural transition and how that fits into climate change discourses is a piece that I found really fascinating. And I was wondering in particular about some of the sort of elite conferences that you talked about, elite development conferences that you talked about being at. And I was wondering about how is this idea of urban rural transition being talked about and being thought about today? Is it very much still a sort of reproduction of Rostow and Lewis and all this sort of early developmentalism talk? Or has the sort of decades of critiques on slumification, for instance, have they had any impact? Is there a different way in which these things are being talked about? Have these critiques entered these spaces in any way that you see as meaningful?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I do see these conversations as very, very old. And I think that to the extent that these critiques have entered these spaces, I think that these discourses around climate change have sort of created new ways of resisting those longstanding critiques of these sort of, the teleology of the urbanization process. So like I had a conversation once with this international donor who leads a lot of kind of adaptation programming throughout South Asia, who was just visiting Bangladesh. And he was saying, in my career, we've seen, in my long career, we've seen this sort of ongoing process of development, meaning moving people out of villages and into cities. And there was always this sense that people had like the human right to stay where they lived if they wanted to. And climate change does something really different, which it says, maybe people don't have the right to stay in their villages and where they want to stay. And I think that this is part of where I think the adaptation regime is kind of a break with existing development regimes, where you saw this sort of, there's like the double movement of moving people out of, of dispossession, and then the need to sort of protect people from that process of dispossession. And now there are these practitioners who are saying, it's no longer necessary to protect the rights of those people, because climate change is going to make this dispossession inevitable no matter what. And so, I found that to be really surprising and disheartening, because I anticipated that there would have had to have been some more reflexivity about, as you said, how much critique there's been about this sort of vision of, moving people into slums. But no, I think that it's just intensifying.
Kasia, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. And it's so cool to see how your project has evolved, I guess, in the last 5 years. So I hear the word climate futures, or at least the futures part, and I tend to think of like positive futures, not because I have like an inherently optimistic outlook. I don't actually think that's true, but I feel like it's been like the discourse around futures recently has been oriented towards trying to come up with, more so-called resilient futures, or more just futures, right? Better futures than the contemporary, right? So I'm wondering if you have other material from your book that speaks to this, or, I think the rice, the sort of like we've reclaimed rice cultivation is like a pretty clear example, but I'm wondering if there's more. And also, how do you research futures, right? Like, how do you talk to people about futures, or interview about futures? I feel like whenever I've asked questions about that, people don't like, that's a really hard thing to ask people. I mean, I don't even know that we would be able to answer those types of questions if people were to come up to us and say, like, how do you envision your future? Like, those are very abstract things, especially people in villages, right, where senses of time are quite different. And, it's hard. It's not like they're drawing on some sort of huge, database of potential futures, right? Or are they coming from the past? Like, what's the method, right? Like, what's the method of investigating the future?
Yeah, that's such a good and interesting question. And I think, so it's funny, a while ago, this grad student at Clark wrote to me and was like, there's this new wave of what I'm calling speculative political ecology. And I think that you're at the forefront of it. And I want you to like be on this panel with me about speculative political ecologies. And I was like, I don't think my work is speculative at all. It's more historical than speculative. I'm interested in ideas in the present about the future. And that's a totally different thing from trying to understand the future. And so I don't think that I really have anything to say about like how we can speculate about the future based on this, sort of my methods. So I think that like when I think about climate futures, I'm thinking about what is the political work of imagining the future rather than like what is a climate future. But I think that there are people who, are imagining the future. And I mean, mostly they're activists. And I think that this is such an interesting question about like, where are climate futures considered positive? And this, I mean, I think this is, I was saying this before about Tuvalu and wishful thinking, and like where, who are the communities that get to have sort of radical visions of future climate justice. And I think that we see a lot of radical sort of coalition building around climate justice happening in the global north. In Bangladesh, I did not find sort of within domestic politics or in local politics, I did not see any kind of radical politics around climate justice. And that was surprising to me because of the sort of scalar politics that I talked about before in response to Marvi's question. In Bangladesh, the environmentalists who I know are the sort of human rights activists, sort of local civil society activists, who I know, when I talk to them about their concerns, they're like, this is not climate change. This is, sort of nuts and bolts political economy issues. And, in my opinion, there are political opportunities in sort of uniting those existing political movements with ideas about climate justice. So I think that we see a lot of this in sort of new coalitions in the United States around a Green New Deal, like radical, public housing movements in New York City saying we are also climate movements. I think that there's been a lot of new space created for that kind of coalition building that allows for that sort of speculative work around climate futures. I think that it's time for there to be, opportunities for coalition building with groups in the global South, like the activists who I work with. And I haven't seen it yet, but I hope that it's coming, because I think that, I'm not going to do the work of speculating, but someone should, and I think that everyone should be involved in it. Phil, are you going to ask me a question about Polanyi? Does he have his hand up?
He does. Phil, would you like to ask your question? Whether it's about Polanyi or not?
Would you like a question about Polanyi?
I think I already answered your question about Polanyi.
Stereotyping me. Anyway, thanks for a terrific talk. And also the answers you've given to the questions have been great also. You started off by mentioning Gramsci and common sense, and it made me think of counter-hegemony. And then when you were talking about Polder II, it struck me that locals were taking matters into their own hands and reviving shrimp farming and labor-intensive agriculture, etc. And so I was going to ask you a question about whether these kinds of communities that are self-organizing, if you like, along more traditional, more resilient lines, were having any kind of effect on the government. So then, listening to the answer to some of the questions, I began thinking about the other dimension of Bangladesh, which I think you and I have talked about, maybe in your B exam, who knows. But it strikes me that the Bangladeshi state, in the way in which you're representing it, is acting really as a conduit for foreign donors, without, as you say, without a lot of accountability, and not making demands as to how those tranches of money coming into the country could be used, in terms of listening to the self-organizing communities that you mentioned. And you just mentioned in response to the last question, Jenny's, I think, that some of those communities have political economic views, perspectives, and it made me think, well, does that mean they're putting pressure on the state to take care of what they're attempting to do in the short term, maybe only, who knows? But it then struck me also that the state is asking for reparations, and what's it doing with those reparations, if they're getting any reparations? What's it claiming to do? Could it claim those reparations could be used to support, to shore up those resilient communities that are actually taking a different tack within the terms of the adaptation regime? In other words, it's a contested regime, may not be politically that much in Bangladesh, and of course that's what I'd like to hear about if you have any thoughts about that. But so then it sort of hits me that maybe Bangladesh and Tuvalu and some of those other island states, or states with the kind of shoreline that Bangladesh has, have a particular vulnerability, and maybe in the long run, as you were talking with Jenny, that they're not going to be able to retain those self-organizing activities. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, a lot of comments on a bunch of really good questions that you've just laid out for me. Yeah, so how to tackle all these questions. Okay, so first, I guess I'll answer this question about like what could be done with these reparations, which I think is a really interesting question. So I had this conversation once with one of the sort of lead Bangladeshi climate negotiators, who was talking about loss and damage and sort of what's owed to Bangladesh. And I said, that all of the losses that have been sort of described already as the result of loss and damage are essentially not actually the result of climate change, but they are what will be, they look like what will look like the result of climate change in the future. But the losses that Bangladesh is experiencing now are essentially the result of colonialism. And if Bangladesh is more vulnerable to climate change because of colonialism, isn't Bangladesh owed reparations for colonialism? Like, and doesn't that make a lot more sense, actually, given what we know is actually happening, than this, discussion about loss and damage, as if that just started in the last like 20 years. And he was like, well, yes, I never thought about it that way. It's right. But, we're not going to win that. We're not going to like win reparations for colonialism at the Conference of Parties. Fair enough, right? Like, I'm not the climate negotiator, but I think that that's probably right based on what I've read about the Conference of Parties. But he was like, what's really different about what we're owed in terms of adaptation and loss and damage is that we've signed treaties that say that we are owed those monies. And that's a totally different thing from development aid, which we were never owed. It was always charity that was given to us. Even if you thought that we were owed it, it never was. The development project was, as Phil, and we've all learned from you, came out of colonialism, but it wasn't, the idea wasn't that it was like reparations for colonialism, right? And so it was never something that, it's a totally different kind of relationship, because it even if it was owed in sort of a normative sense, it was not owed according to any kind of treaties. And he was like, once we get the money, we can do whatever we want with it. Now, so he was sort of saying like, so maybe, it can be radical because it's owed to us and then we can do whatever we want with it once it comes to us. I personally haven't seen that, it is being used in any way that's different from development. And I mean, the Bangladeshi state is currently a one-party, an authoritarian one-party state. And so it isn't, this sort of like radical bastion of like some new vision of political futures in the global South. But I think that, as you said, there are some really interesting things to be said for the ways that local communities in Bangladesh are resisting visions of adaptation, and what that could mean for different ways of thinking about what adaptation could look like. And so, with Polder 22, I think that, you said, are they having any impact on the government? I think, it would probably be, it's pretty isolated. There are some communities, like I said, it's growing. It isn't like a dominant vision in the coastal region that, this sort of alternative vision. But I think that it does sort of puncture the hegemony of this idea of this completely doomed future. And so, when I would talk to people who work at development agencies about Polder 22 or other communities where people have slowly started to say, like, let's go back to rice farming, like I would hear people say, in Dhaka, like development practitioners say, well, this is the only option, shrimp or these kinds of projects that we're pursuing. And when I said, well, it's not, we've seen in, communities like Polder 22 and a few others that actually rice farming is still viable, they would say, well, okay, yes, that's true, but I mean, realistically, it's not really the best vision of development, right? Like, isn't this better for Bangladesh because it brings in, foreign exchange, money, and, blah, blah, blah. And so that's a different thing, right? Like, to say this is necessary because of our development vision is really different from saying this is necessary because of climate change. And so I think that just like continuing to say, like, we're here and we are insisting on this particular way of pursuing the future that so many agencies are telling us is not even possible, I think that that's really radical. And I don't know how much impact it's having on the state, but I like to think that even just like doing a little bit of my own piece of saying like, this is something that we need to hear, that these people have this different vision of the future. I like to think it has some kind of impact. I shared this with the World Bank annual meetings a couple of weeks ago, and the World Bank officials in Dhaka apparently complained about me, which I thought maybe meant that I was having a little bit of an impact. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's the answer to your question. I don't know if it's having an impact on the state, but I do think that it is, it undermines the hegemony of the adaptation regime for sure.
Thanks. And actually, just a quick comment on that, because when I said that the Bangladeshi state appears to be a conduit for foreign donors, it's very worrying because, as you probably know, the outcome of COP26 was that the financial world was given quite a lot of free rein to begin to design responses to future climate change. And so it raises questions about the role of states and to what extent they are becoming increasingly governed, if you like, by global financial interests. That's certainly true with the United Nations Food System Summit recently. So, I mean, Bangladesh may be an extreme case, as I kind of implied, but it's really an interesting problem. But thanks so much. Great to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
Well, I think that's a good point to wrap things up. Thank you again for sharing your work with us. It's really been a pleasure to hear all about your research in Bangladesh. And I'd like to
all your great questions. It was really a pleasure.
Mm-hmm. And thank you to all of the audience members who attended and asked questions. And yeah, Jenny, would you like to say anything about the series?
Just not really. I mean, just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. If you've come to we've had 3 this semester, and it's kind of the new version of our, I guess what used to be the Development Sociology Seminar Series. We've rebranded. It's the Critical Development Studies Series, and it will be online for the foreseeable future, in part because we've had really great attendance online and people can easily come and be speakers, which is great. We will have 3 again online, same time next semester. Stay tuned. They haven't been scheduled yet, but they will be. So that's all. And thanks to David and Marby, who've been really great collaborators in organizing this.
Bye. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, that's all. The unceremonious dump you off to, Kasia. Yeah. Sorry, we can't take you out to dinner.
I'll take a rain check though, and next time I come to Ithaca, hopefully we'll see you soon. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
Bye.
Take care.